The summer heat of 1883 had settled over Red Creek like a shroud, but it was nothing next to the inferno in Clara Weston's eyes. She watched Ethan Cole from the shadows of the Dusty Rose Saloon, and the world outside went quiet. The laughter still echoed in the street. That boy can shoot a silver dollar from 100 paces, but he's never even touched a woman's hand. The words were meant to sting, to humiliate, and they did, but not in the way they thought. What those cowboys didn't see, what they were too blind to ever understand, was the tremor in Ethan's hand. It wasn't fear. It wasn't cowardice. It was the restraint of a chained animal. Clara saw it. She saw the moment his fingers twitched, moving toward the worn leather of his Colt, then freezing in place. He wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of himself. In a town where a man's worth was measured in lead and liquor, Ethan Cole was a ghost. The deadliest shot in 3 counties, yet he'd never drawn his gun in anger. He could kill a man before he hit the ground, but he treated every woman in town like she was made of spun glass. But Clara Weston knew she was made of fire and steel, and tonight she was done waiting in the shadows. What happens when a wildfire meets a powder keg? What happens when the sheriff's daughter decides she wants the one man in the world her father has forbidden her from even looking at? Stick with me, because this story, it's going to burn this whole town to the ground before it's over. 3 days. 3 days had passed since the moment at the Dusty Rose, and the memory was a brand on Ethan Cole's mind. It wasn't Jake Morrison's sneering face he saw when he closed his eyes. It was the eyes watching from the shadows. Clara Weston's eyes, dark as a moonless night, sharp as a fresh-honed blade. They held something that squeezed his chest tight, something that stole the air from his lungs. He was in the livery stable, rasping a hoof on his mare, when he heard them. Footsteps. Light, sure, not trying to be silent, but not trying to be heard either. The sound of someone who went where they pleased. "You're wondering why I didn't defend myself," he said, his voice low and steady. He didn't look up from the horse. "No." The voice came from the shaft of sunlight pouring through the barn door, and Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. She stepped into the light, and he forgot how to breathe. A simple blue dress, but the sun caught the curve of her waist, the defiant set of her shoulders. Her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, framing a face that was far too beautiful. "I'm wondering why you wanted to." He looked up then. He met her gaze, and a jolt went through him, hot and sharp. There was a raw intelligence in her eyes, a knowing that stripped him bare, and something else, something wild and dangerous that made his mouth go bone dry. "Your father isn't here," he said, his voice rough. She took another step, then another, close enough now that the scent of lavender and sunshine filled his head, close enough to see the ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "I asked you a question, Ethan Cole." The way she said his name was a caress and a challenge all at once. It made something old and primitive stir in the pit of his stomach. He set the mare's hoof down and straightened up, turning to face her fully. She was still too close. Way too close. "Men like Morrison," he said, his throat tight. "They aren't worth the bullet." "But you wanted to kill him." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She stepped closer still, and Ethan felt the rough wood of the stall wall against his back. He had nowhere else to go. She was a foot shorter than him, 100 pounds lighter, but in that moment she held all the power in the world. "Yes," he admitted, the word torn from his throat. "Why didn't you?" "Because." The word was stuck, a rock in his throat. He couldn't tell her the truth, not the whole truth. How could he explain the promise he'd made to his dying mother? "Never use your strength to protect your pride, Ethan. Only to protect those who have none." How could he tell her that he saw what the violence did to other men, how it hollowed them out until there was nothing left but the monster? But looking into her eyes, all those reasons felt like lies. "Because what, Ethan?" Her hand came up, her fingertips just barely brushing the worn cotton of his shirt. He flinched back as if she'd held a hot iron to his skin. "Don't!" The word was sharp, desperate. Her eyes flashed, a flicker of hurt quickly replaced by raw defiance. "Don't what? Don't touch you? Or don't make you feel something you're afraid of?" "Clara." He pressed himself into the wall, the wood digging into his spine. You don't understand. Then make me. How could he explain the real reason? The secret he carried like a stone in his gut. The truth his mother had confessed on her deathbed. The truth about his father. Not the kind farmer he remembered, but the man he'd been before. A man whose hands were so stained with blood that he had to run, to change his name, to hide from a past that would eventually catch up and kill him. His mother's words echoed in his memory, a chilling whisper from the grave. The same darkness is in you, Ethan. Fight it. Never let it have you. He said nothing. She watched his face, her eyes searching, and he knew she saw the war raging inside him. She took a small step back, and for a second he thought she would leave. He almost prayed she would. Instead, she reached for the laces at the front of her dress. What are you doing? Ethan's voice was a strangled whisper. Showing you something. Her fingers were deft, sure. The laces came loose, and she pushed the fabric away from her shoulder. There on the smooth, sun-kissed skin of her collarbone was a scar, long, thin, and silver against her skin. A Mustang threw me into a fence post 3 years ago, she said, her voice even. 18 stitches. Doc Miller said I was lucky it didn't kill me. Ethan stared. He stared at the scar, at the way it traced the delicate curve of her bone before disappearing beneath the edge of her chemise. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. Why are you showing me this? Because you look at me like I'm made of porcelain. She stepped closer again, and this time he was frozen, trapped in the intensity of her gaze. Like I'll shatter if you even breathe on me too hard. But I'm not delicate, Ethan. I'm not some fragile flower you need to protect. Her fingers found his chest again, pressing flat against his heart. This time he didn't pull away. He couldn't. The heat of her touch was a firebrand, searing through his shirt, through his skin, straight into his soul. Clara, your father would kill me if he even knew you were in here. Her smile was pure wickedness. Does that scare you? Yes. The honesty was a betrayal, slipping past his defenses before he could stop it. Good. She rose onto her toes, her lips so close to his ear he could feel her breath. It should. And then her mouth was on his. It wasn't a kiss. It was a collision. It wasn't gentle or chaste or anything he could have ever imagined. It was hungry, demanding. It was Clara taking exactly what she wanted without apology, without hesitation. For a heartbeat, Ethan was stone. And then 28 years of promises, of restraint, of iron-willed control, shattered into a million pieces. His hands found her waist, yanking her hard against him, and a low sound escaped her throat, a sound of pure victory that lit a fire in his blood. She tasted of cinnamon and rebellion, her hands tangled in his hair, pulling his mouth harder against hers. And when she bit his lower lip, a groan was torn from his chest. The sound shocked them both. They broke apart, breathing hard, their chests heaving. Her lips were swollen, her eyes dark and dazed. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken things. I should go, she whispered, but her hands were still gripping his shirt. Yes, he agreed, but his hands were still locked on her waist. My father will be looking for me. Yes. Neither of them moved an inch. Then the sound of hoofbeats in the yard shattered the spell. Sheriff Weston's voice boomed across the dusty air. Clara, you in there, girl? She jerked away, her fingers fumbling with the laces of her dress. She shot Ethan one last look. A promise and a threat and an invitation all rolled into one devastating package. Then she smoothed her skirt and walked toward the stable door, her composure absolute, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. Coming, Papa. As she passed him, she whispered so low only he could hear, her lips never moving. Tonight, the old oak by Miller's Creek, if you're man enough. Then she was gone, leaving him standing in a shaft of golden sunlight, his heart hammering like a blacksmith's forge, the ghost of her kiss burning on his lips. He was a dead man. Ethan didn't go to Miller's Creek that night. He told himself it was the right thing to do. The honorable thing. She was the sheriff's daughter, untouchable, forbidden. He was a drifter with a dark past and a darker nature, A man with nothing to his name but a fast gun and a promise he was terrified of breaking. She deserved better. But that night, he dreamed of her. He dreamed of cinnamon and defiance, of the heat of her skin and the fire in her eyes. He woke up in a cold sweat, aching with a need so sharp it felt like a sickness, the phantom taste of her still on his tongue. He was losing the fight. The next evening, she found him anyway. He was checking his trap lines along the creek, the full moon hanging in the sky like a silver coin. She appeared from the cottonwoods like an apparition, a ghost in the pale light. She was dressed in men's clothes, dark pants that clung to her curves and a white shirt so thin it was almost translucent in the moonlight. "You didn't come," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, just a flat statement. "No." He kept his eyes on the dark, swirling water of the creek. Looking at her was a mistake he couldn't afford to make twice. "Why?" "You know why, Clara. Because you think I'm a child?" There was a new edge to her voice. Steel. "Because you think I don't know my own mind? Or is it because you've decided what I deserve?" She moved closer, and he could feel the heat coming off her, even from a few feet away. "What is it I deserve, Ethan? Some pampered town boy who'll buy me ribbons and treat me like a porcelain doll?" She was beside him now, her shoulder almost brushing his. "I've met those men. They bore me to tears." Against his better judgment, he looked at her. It was a mistake. The moonlight turned her skin to mother of pearl, her dark hair to a river of midnight silk. She was so beautiful it was a physical pain, a sharp ache right in the center of his chest. "What do you want from me, Clara?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Everything." The word hung in the air between them, heavy as a shroud. "I want to know what it feels like to be truly wanted," she said, her voice dropping to a husky murmur. "Not as a prize, not as the sheriff's daughter, as a woman." She reached for the top button of her shirt. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. "Don't!" But the word had no force. It was a plea, not a command. Her eyes met his, and he saw a challenge there. "Are you going to stop me?" He should have. He should have turned his back and walked away. He should have run. Instead, he watched, mesmerized, as her free hand went to the second button. Then the third. The white cotton parted, falling open to reveal the soft curves of her breasts, barely hidden by a thin chemise. "Clara," he breathed, his resolve crumbling to dust. "Touch me," she whispered. It was an order. His hands were shaking as he let go of her wrist. His fingers found the narrow space of her waist, then slid upward, tracing the swell of her breast through the fine linen. She gasped, a sharp, broken sound, and arched into his touch. That sound was his undoing. "We can't," he managed to say, even as his other hand came up to cup her face. "We can." Her hands were at his shirt now, her fingers clumsy but determined, pushing the rough fabric from his shoulders. "No one ever has to know." Her fingertips traced the network of old scars on his chest, a roadmap of a hard life. He shuddered at her touch. She leaned forward, her lips pressing against a puckered scar high on his chest, right over his heart. And Ethan Cole stopped thinking entirely. They sank down onto the cool, soft grass by the water's edge. It was a fever, a madness. Hands explored, clothes were discarded, barriers fell away one by one. He had never known a woman's touch. He had spent his life imagining it, fearing it, denying himself. He had thought it would be gentle, soft. He had never imagined this wild, desperate claiming. He had never known skin could be this soft, never heard sounds like the ones that escaped Clara's throat when his lips traced a path down her neck, over her shoulder, to the hollow between her collarbones. "Show me," she breathed against his ear, her voice ragged. "Show me what you want." His trembling hands found the simple ties of her chemise. The last flimsy barrier dissolved in the moonlight. She was all curves and shadows, warm and welcoming, and utterly perfect. When he lowered his head and took her nipple into his mouth, she cried out, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her body arching off the ground. They were lost, drowned in a world of moonlight and sensation, so consumed by each other that they didn't hear the hoofbeats. Not until it was too late. "Clara!" Sheriff Weston's voice was a razor blade, slicing through the night. Clara gasped, scrambling away from him, fumbling for her clothes. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no way to pretend this was anything other than what it was. Ethan moved on pure instinct, surging to his feet, putting his body between Clara and her father as the sheriff swung down from his horse. The older man's face was a mask of cold, murderous fury in the moonlight. "Step away from my daughter, boy." The sheriff's hand was resting on the butt of his pistol. "Papa, please," Clara begged, pulling her shirt on, her fingers shaking so badly she couldn't manage the buttons. "I said step away." Weston's voice cracked like a whip. Ethan slowly raised his hands, showing they were empty, but he didn't move back. He wouldn't leave her exposed. "Sheriff, this isn't what it looks like." The sheriff let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Isn't what it looks like? I find you rutting in the dirt with my daughter half naked, and you tell me it's not what it looks like? You think I'm a fool?" He took a step forward, his eyes burning with a hatred so intense it was almost a physical force. "I knew you were trouble the day you rode into my town, but I never thought—" His voice broke with rage. "I never thought you were a snake." "It's not his fault, Papa." Clara was on her feet now, her shirt buttoned crookedly. "I came to him. I wanted this." "You don't know what you want," Weston roared, his gaze never leaving Ethan's face. "He took advantage of you. He's ruined you." "No one ruined me." Clara's voice shook with a fury that matched her father's. "I am not a child. I am not your property." The sheriff flinched as if she'd slapped him. His face went pale, his jaw working silently. For a long moment, the only sound was the rushing of the creek and the ragged sound of their breathing. Then the sheriff looked past Ethan, his eyes locking on something on the ground, a small, dark object lying in the grass. With two quick strides, he bent and picked it up. It was Ethan's knife, a unique blade, with a handle carved from staghorn, a gift from his father. It must have fallen from its sheath on his belt. The sheriff turned it over in his hand, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes lifted to meet Ethan's, and Ethan saw something new in them. Not just anger, recognition, and pure cold fear. "Where did you get this knife?" The sheriff's voice was a deadly whisper. Ethan's blood ran cold. "It was my father's." Sheriff Weston's face contorted, a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. He looked from the knife in his hand to Ethan's face, as if seeing him for the very first time, as if seeing a ghost. "Your father," the sheriff said, his voice barely audible. "What was his name?" "James Cole." The sheriff took a staggering step back, the color draining from his face. He looked at Ethan as if he were looking at the devil himself. "Get on your horse, Clara," he said, his voice hollow. "Go home. Now." "But Papa—" "Now!" The command was absolute, terrifying in its quiet intensity. Clara shot Ethan a look of confusion and fear. Then, without another word, she mounted her horse and vanished into the darkness. The two men stood alone in the moonlight, the terrible silence stretching between them. Finally, the sheriff spoke, his voice shaking with an emotion Ethan couldn't name. "You have until dawn," he said, his eyes still fixed on Ethan's face with that look of horrified recognition. "Get out of my county. If I ever see you again, if you ever come near my daughter again, I swear on your father's grave, I will kill you." He turned, mounted his horse, and spurted into a gallop, disappearing into the night. Leaving Ethan standing alone by the creek, the world knocked out from under him. The taste of Clara was still on his lips, but now it was mixed with the bitter taste of a mystery he didn't understand. Why did his father's knife fill the sheriff with such terror? And what secret had just been unearthed in the moonlight? Ethan Cole had never been good at taking orders, especially when they came from a man with a ghost in his eyes. He didn't leave Red Creek. He couldn't. He made a cold camp in the rocky hills overlooking the town, a shadow among shadows. He told himself he was staying to make sure Clara was all right, to make sure her father's strange, violent reaction hadn't turned on her. But that was only half the truth. He was staying because of the look on Sheriff Weston's face, a look that said this wasn't about a father protecting his daughter. This was about something else, something old and buried and dangerous, something that had to do with his own father. 3 agonizing days passed. He watched the town from a distance, a hawk circling its prey. He saw the sheriff riding patrol, his face a grim, stony mask. He saw Clara moving through town, a shadow of herself, her head held high but her eyes filled with worry. On the third night, a boy found him, Tommy Martinez, the young stable hand. He crept up to Ethan's camp like a frightened rabbit, holding a folded piece of paper. "From Miss Clara," he whispered, thrusting it at Ethan before scurrying back into the darkness. The note was short, her handwriting rushed and frantic. "He knows who you are. The Dalton gang are a distraction. It's a trap meant for you. They're coming to kill you. Get out. Please." Ethan read the note again, then a third time. His blood turned to ice in his veins. The Dalton gang? What did they have to do with any of this? And what did she mean, "He knows who you are"? He burned the note, the tiny flame reflecting in his cold, hard eyes. He was done running from ghosts. He began checking his weapons. At dawn, he saw them ride out. Sheriff Weston and two deputies. They were headed east, towards Willow Creek, where the Daltons had supposedly been sighted. It looked like a standard patrol, but Ethan knew better. Clara's note was a warning. The sheriff wasn't hunting the Daltons. The sheriff was leading the hunters to their prey. To him. He saddled his horse and followed, a phantom moving through the broken country. He didn't follow the main trail. He used the high ridges, the hidden arroyos, the skills his father had taught him to move unseen. He wasn't tracking the sheriff. He was hunting him. The trap was sprung at sunset. They'd chosen the spot well. A narrow canyon, sheer rock walls rising on both sides. A perfect kill box. Gunfire exploded from the rocks above, the thunder of rifles echoing off the canyon walls. But the shots weren't aimed at the trail where Ethan should have been. They were aimed down, into the canyon floor, at Sheriff Weston and his deputies. From his vantage point on the ridge, Ethan saw it all unfold. The sheriff's posse pinned down behind a miserable cluster of boulders. Muzzle flashes from at least a half-dozen rifles on both sides of the canyon, catching them in a brutal crossfire. It was an ambush, a slaughter. One deputy went down, then the other, cut to pieces before they even knew what was happening. The sheriff was alone, firing back, but it was hopeless. He was wounded, blood staining his shirt, his movements slow. They weren't hunting Ethan. They were murdering the sheriff. Clara's note had been wrong, or had it. It's a trap meant for you. And in that instant, Ethan understood. The rumor about the Daltons, the patrol, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed stage. They wanted the sheriff out of town, isolated, and they wanted Ethan to follow. They meant to kill them both. Clara hadn't been wrong. She'd just gotten one detail turned around. The trap wasn't for him, it was for her father, and he was the bait. "I swear on your father's grave. I will kill you." The sheriff's threat was a raw wound in his memory, but Clara's face was sharper, clearer, her desperate plea. "Please." He raised his Winchester to his shoulder, sighted down the long barrel, and began to work. His first shot took out a rifleman on the northern ridge, the man spinning and falling from his perch like a discarded doll. The second shot silenced a rifle on the opposite side. The hidden gunman, so focused on the sheriff below, had no idea death was raining down on them from the sky. By the time they realized they were taking fire from their rear, from above, it was too late. Ethan was already moving, sliding down the scree slope, his Colt in his hand, a wraith of vengeance emerging from the twilight. "Sheriff!" he yelled, diving behind the same cluster of rocks as bullets chewed the air above his head. "You hit bad?" Weston stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Cole, what in God's name are you doing here? I told you to get out of my county." "Clara sent me," Ethan said, peering around the edge of the boulder, counting muzzle flashes. 3 left, maybe 4. "She said you were walking into a trap. This doesn't change a thing between us, boy." A bullet ricocheted off the rock, inches from Ethan's face, stinging his cheek with stone fragments. "Can we argue about it after they're done trying to kill us?" For the first time, a flicker of something other than rage crossed the sheriff's face. It might have been a grim smile. "Fair point." They fought like demons, back to back, a symphony of destruction. Ethan's marksmanship was supernatural, each shot precise, economical, deadly. But the sheriff was a fighter, grizzled and tough, his experience showing in every move, every calculated risk. They moved as one, covering each other, two men united by a common enemy, and the woman they both loved. When the last echo of gunfire faded into the twilight, the canyon was silent. 7 bodies lay scattered among the rocks. Not one of them was a Dalton. Ethan recognized 2 of them. Ranch hands from the Big Cross Sea outfit north of town. The same outfit Jake Morrison worked for. This was no outlaw ambush. This was an execution squad. Sheriff Weston sagged against a boulder, his face pale, his hand pressed tight against the bloody wound in his shoulder. He stared at the bodies, then looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding. "Why?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You should have let them kill me. It would have made your life a hell of a lot simpler." Ethan reloaded his Colt, the quiet clicks of the mechanism loud in the sudden silence. He didn't meet the older man's eyes. "Because she loves you," he said quietly, "and she would have hated me for the rest of her life if I let you die." "Even though I threatened to kill you? Even though?" They rode back to town under a canopy of stars, a heavy, suffocating silence between them. Both men were lost in their own thoughts, the pieces of a dark puzzle clicking into place. It wasn't until the faint, distant lights of Red Creek appeared on the horizon that the sheriff spoke again. "You love her?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "More than my own life," Ethan answered, the truth of it settling deep in his bones. "Her mother," the sheriff's voice was soft, haunted. "She was like Clara, headstrong, fearless. She saw injustice and she couldn't look away." He paused, the silence stretching. "Everyone in town thinks she died of a fever, along with our boy. That's the story I told. It was a lie." Ethan waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "She found out the man who runs the Cross Sea, Old Man Blackwood, was stealing water rights from the smaller homesteaders. She gathered proof. She was going to expose him." The sheriff's voice broke. "They burned our ranch, made it look like an accident. She and our son were trapped inside. I was away in town for supplies. By the time I got back," he didn't need to finish. The raw pain in his voice painted the picture. "I've spent the last 15 years trying to keep Clara from making the same mistake, trying to protect her from Blackwood, from the darkness in this town. When I saw you with her, when I saw that knife, I thought—" "You thought my father had come back," Ethan finished for him. The sheriff nodded, his face etched with old grief in the moonlight. "Your father, James Cole, or as I knew him, Jack the Ghost Coltrane. He was the man Blackwood hired to do his dirty work back then. He was the most feared enforcer in the territory. He was the one who set the fire." Ethan felt the world spin. The air was sucked from his lungs. It couldn't be true. His father, the gentle man who taught him how to track and hunt, who read to him by the firelight. A killer? An arsonist? "No," Ethan whispered. "You're wrong." "Am I?" The sheriff's voice was gentle now, laced with a pity that was worse than his anger. The staghorn knife. It was his trademark. I saw it that night, tucked in his belt, the firelight glinting off the blade. I never forgot it. When I saw it in your hand, I thought the past had come back to kill us all. I thought Blackwood had sent his son to finish the job." The pieces fell into place. His mother's dying words. "The same darkness is in you." She hadn't been speaking of some vague inherited evil. She'd been talking about the specific murderous blood of Jack Coltrane. The promise he'd made her wasn't about honor. It was about survival. It was a desperate plea for him not to become his father. "I didn't know," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "I see that now," the sheriff said. They could hear voices from the town ahead, the sound of an anxious crowd gathering. "You saved my life tonight. From the same man who murdered my family and destroyed my life. The same man who hired your father." "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his mind reeling. Sheriff Weston was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the lights of Red Creek. "Now," he said, his voice grim, hard as forged steel. "Now we finish what my wife started." He turned to look at Ethan, his eyes boring into him. The question is, are you your father's son, or are you the man Clara thinks you are? Clara was waiting for them in the middle of the street, a lantern held high, her face a pale oval of fear in the flickering light. When she saw them, she ran. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself first at her father, her arms wrapping around his neck, her face buried in his good shoulder. "Papa, I was so scared." "I'm all right, girl," Sheriff Weston said, his voice thick with emotion. He gently disentangled himself and turned her, his hands on her shoulders. "Thanks to him." He looked at Ethan, and in the sheriff's eyes, Ethan saw a message pass, an alliance forged in blood and fire. Clara turned to Ethan, and the look in her eyes, a storm of relief, gratitude, and a love so fierce it buckled his knees, made the entire town, the entire world fade away. There was only her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with tears, and before he could say a word, she was kissing him. Right there in the middle of the street, in front of her father, in front of the whole damn town. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, and the promise of a future he never thought he'd have. It was a claiming. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Everyone stared, waiting for the explosion, waiting for Sheriff Weston to tear them apart, to arrest Ethan, to maybe even kill him. When Clara finally pulled back, her hands remained on his chest. She kept her eyes locked on his, a silent declaration to everyone watching. "I thought I'd lost you," she said, just for him. "Never," he whispered back. "Clara." The sheriff's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of command. "Come here." She took a half step back from Ethan, but her hand found his, her fingers lacing through his. She would not be separated from him. She was making her choice, drawing her line in the sand for all to see. Father and daughter faced each other in the lamplight. A lifetime of unspoken grief and fierce, protective love hung between them. "You're sure about this, girl?" the sheriff asked, his gaze flickering from her face to the man whose hand she held. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Papa," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Just like Mama was sure about you." The words struck home. A pained expression crossed the sheriff's face, a flicker of an old wound exposed. He nodded slowly, a deep, weary sigh escaping him. He looked at Ethan, his eyes hard as flint. "You hurt her, and there is no hole deep enough for you to hide in." "I won't." "You better not." The sheriff's gaze swept over the crowd, landing on Jake Morrison, who was trying to shrink back into the shadows. "Because this man is going to need a good deputy, and I think I've just found him." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Clara's hand tightened on Ethan's, her eyes wide with shock. "Papa, you mean—" "I mean," the sheriff said, his voice booming across the street, his eyes still locked on the nervous-looking hands from the Cross Sea. "If Mr. Cole is going to help me clean up the corruption in this town, he might as well have a badge to do it." It was a declaration of war. The crowd erupted, some with cheers, some with nervous, uncertain murmurs, but Ethan barely heard them. He was looking at Clara, who was now laughing through her tears, her face shining with a joy so pure it felt like a sunrise. She threw herself into his arms and he held her tight, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her. "Is that a yes?" he whispered against her ear. "That's a yes to everything," she whispered back, her voice fierce and full of promise. "Forever." 6 months later, the church bells of Red Creek rang out, a joyful sound across the Texas plains. Clara Weston became Clara Cole. She looked like an angel in her mother's wedding dress, her hands steady and warm in Ethan's, as they spoke their vows before God and the entire town. Sheriff Weston walked her down the aisle, pride and a bittersweet sorrow warring in his eyes. Jake Morrison, now a reformed man after a long, soul-searching conversation with the sheriff's fist, stood as Ethan's best man. The town had chosen a side. The small ranchers, the shopkeepers, the families who had been squeezed and terrorized by Blackwood for years, they all stood with their sheriff and his new deputy. Red Creek was drawing a line. But it was that night, in the small house Ethan had built for them at the edge of town, that the real war began. Clara stood by the window, bathed in moonlight, a vision in her white nightgown. The fear and uncertainty of the past months had been replaced by a quiet, determined strength. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan asked, his voice soft as he came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "I've been ready since the day I first saw you," she whispered, leaning back against his chest. She turned in his arms, her eyes searching his. "The question is, are you?" He thought of his father, the monster he'd never known. He thought of his mother's fear, and he looked down at Clara, at this incredible, strong, fearless woman who had seen the darkness in him and wasn't afraid. Who had chosen him anyway? She didn't want a saint. She wanted a man, her man. To honor her wasn't to deny that part of himself. It was to use it, to protect her, to protect their home, to build a future from the ashes of the past. "Yes," he whispered, and he sealed the promise with a kiss. Through the window, the lights of Red Creek twinkled like stars that had fallen to earth. Their town, their home, their fight. And as Ethan lifted his new wife into his arms and carried her to their bed, neither of them saw it. Far out in the darkness, on the hills controlled by the Cross Sea Ranch, a single bonfire blazed to life, a signal. On his porch across town, Sheriff Weston saw it. He took a long drink from his glass of whiskey, the firelight reflecting in his hard, cold eyes. He set the glass down and picked up the rifle leaning against his chair, the oiled metal gleaming in the lamplight. His daughter was happy, his town was ready, and the war had just begun. And there you have it, a story of a love that was destined to be forged in fire. But if you think this is the end, if you think a wedding and a declaration of war is where their story stops, then you haven't been paying attention. If you want to know what happens when the forces of a ruthless cattle baron descend on this small Texas town, if you want to see a man fight the ghost of his own father to become the hero his wife knows he can be, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Share this story with someone who loves a good fight, and let me know in the comments below who you think is going to win the war for Red Creek. Because trust me, the West is wild. But the fight for love and justice? That's a whole lot wilder.